I'm giving my life story, my personal testimony. It sounds kind of facetious for a man who's just in his early 30s to give his life story. I'm really 39, but that's early 30s. 39 is right. I'm not pulling a Jack Benny on you. I was born the first time in 1927. But I'm going to tell you about this new birth. I'm going to tell you what happened to me. And we're going to bring out some things in my life story that might sound a little peculiar to you, but I believe a lot of you here tonight may be going on that same road I was on for so long. But when you hear my testimony, it's mine. It's not yours. A lot of times people try to pattern the testimony after someone else they've heard. Listen, you only have your own testimony. And if you don't have one, then maybe you can have one tonight before you leave. There are only two types of people in this crowd tonight, and this moved up close to around 3,000 again this evening. And that's a good Friday night crowd in anybody's church, don't you think so? But the only two types of people in this building tonight. The first of that type is the, and the second is the. That's it. Now, we might have rich men or poor men, but they only lost or saved. We might have high steeple, few people type church members, or we might have Skid Row type church members, but they are only lost or saved. So I'm going to tell you a story about a businessman who was at the age of 30 before he was converted, $1 million producer in the life insurance business, and I'm going to tell you what happened to me when I got in the greatest insurance business. All right, to begin a life story, you have to start somewhere. So I'll start. I was born at a very early age in life in a little town called Sweetwater, Alabama. Now, there's nothing in the world exciting about being born in Sweetwater, Alabama, but you have to be born somewhere the first time, so later on you can be born again. We're going to move along pretty rapidly. Sweetwater, Alabama didn't have but two churches. One up on the hill was a Methodist church. The other one down in the valley was a Baptist church. When one wasn't working, the other one was. We had union services some Sunday, and sometimes we had services every third Sunday and every fifth Sunday, and had fifths in town too. So it's amazing about little Sweetwater, Alabama, good little town. And so this particular Sunday, I was 9 years old. Of course, I was 9 years old all that year, but this particular Sunday, I never will forget, my daddy didn't smoke or drink or cuss or anything like that. I can't say my daddy had any real bad habits. The only habit he had that really made an impression on me as a child was he chewed bloodhound chewing tobacco. Do you ever know anybody that chews bloodhound chewing tobacco? Any kind of chewing tobacco. That'll make an impression on a kid, especially if you're riding in the back seat and that wind's blowing from the north. I was about 12 years old before I found out those brown spots weren't freckles on my face. I tell you. But it's amazing how this particular habit made such an impression on me. Well, this particular Sunday night, they were having a protracted meeting up at the Methodist church, and my grandmother was visiting town. She was a Schultz, came over from Germany, and she said to me that she wanted to take me up to church that night because she had something she wanted me to do, and when we came home, it pleased my mother. So my mother couldn't go because my aunt from Detroit was visiting, so my grandmother carried me to church. Little short, stocky, red-faced Methodist preacher, and he could just really preach hard, turn red in the face and foam at the mouth. But anyway, I could get in my usual nap. And you remember the old pews in the churches that you made out of a 1x3 and a couple-inch crack in the middle, and you could kind of lay right in there between them and get you a pretty good little siesta going. And if you couldn't sleep, you could always play with the dirt dauber nest or the gum or something under the pews. And so there I was in this church. Came time for the invitation, and my grandmother punched me and said, "Now, Bobby, you go down the aisle and join the church, and when we get home, we'll tell your mother, and she'll be real proud of you." I said, "All right, when I go, Grandma?" She said, "Go now." So I went. And when I got down to the front, the preacher was saying, "God bless you," and he introduced me to the people, and they voted me into the church, and the people came by hugging my neck, and the women would hug my neck, and the girls would hug my neck, and I was just 9, but I was having a blast down at the front, see? All right, now the point of the telling is this. There are a lot of people when they're 9 or 8 or 7 who have experiences with the Lord that's just as real as an adult. But I'm telling you about what happened to me. You may have joined the church at 9 and meant it from the bottom of your heart. But when I joined the church, I was just joining a church. I didn't know anything at all about giving my heart to Jesus. I didn't know I could ask him into my heart and he'd save my soul. So let me tell you a little bit more about my upbringing in the little town of Sweetwater. My dad and mother were the big folks of Sweetwater, so to speak. He had the big store, he had the big sawmill, he had the planer mill, he had the 10,000-acre plantation. There were 38 colored families living on my dad's plantation. So you can see in Sweetwater, Alabama, if you call it raised with a silver spoon in your mouth, I guess I was. I thank God for it, because my mother and daddy tried to use all the money they could to develop a good all-American type boy. I remember my mama gave me piano lessons. I took that. And she gave me trumpet lessons. Every time we had a tutor or a player or something coming through town, I took whatever they was teaching. And we had a tap dance teacher come through, and I hit that a lick or two. I never will forget one summer we had one of these toe dances come through. And I tried that for a summer. And you never have really been blessed till you see me cut across the stage on my toes. But you know, here's what I'm trying to get over, is my mom and daddy were and are the greatest people in the world, but they were trying to do everything in the world for me, but they forgot the greatest thing in the world, and that was to lead me to the Lord. Now, my mom and daddy led me to the church. My mother and daddy were active in the church. My daddy was the chairman of every committee that needed money. My daddy and mother were very active in all the participation of the social life, and the church was a social life. In Sweetwater, that was the community house. It was a church. It was a civic club. Everything happened at the church. But I didn't know anything about being saved and knowing the Lord. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of you listening to me tonight who are adult people who have gone along that same kind of religious background, that same kind of Christianity, and I was just as lost as if I was a heathen in Africa. Well, the war was going on when I was a teenager, so my mother and daddy sent me off to a military school, and I was a pretty good sized boy. I was pretty good size when I was born. I was weighing about 10 and a half, 11 pounds. I was top heavy till I was 4, used to tilt when I walked. I'd never have worn a size 7 hat. And old Charles Lindbergh was a hero. It wasn't the Beatles in my day. It was Charles Lindbergh. And I remember we wore aviator caps with gargles out front. And my mother had the hardest time finding an aviator cap to fit her big-headed son. So what she finally wound up doing was buying the biggest she could and cutting a V in the bag and putting elastic on it and popping it down on my head, see. But I was tough, running around in my big head. But a little bit later, my body caught it and looked like it was going to pass it. Well, anyway, war going on, and my dad, having the money that he needed, sent me off to a military school in preparatory conditioning for Annapolis or West Point. I thought it was preparation for there, but I found out later it was just about a reform school with tuition. But anyway, when I got up there, thank God I went, because they helped discipline me to study. They helped require me to study, so I needed that, because at Sweetwater playing football, and me and Mr. Harrington's son was kind of taking me on through school pretty fast. Well, at the military school, I was the only boy there, I think, that played the violin. And I remember I used to walk across the campus with this violin case. And you know, it just looked funny. I was already kind of big and everything, and my fuzz trying to come through my pimples, and I remember how they used to laugh at me and call me sissy and chicken, and I was a big chicken too, tell you, walking across. And I sent it home. You know who laughed at me about playing a violin? Is some guy that couldn't play the radio unless it picked up static. You know who else laughed at you? Some guy that couldn't play on the linoleum without catching a cold. It's amazing. But I listened to these characters instead of somebody that should have been advising me. Let me tell you something. If you've got talent to play the violin or the trumpet, or if it's just blowing a jug, do it for the Lord and don't let anybody discourage you. Well, nothing in the world is more of a thrill than to see Mac and his quartet sing and then go over to the piano and play and see these men with the instruments, and Carol over here picking up that overgrown violin and playing it a lick or two. I wish I had listened to my mother instead of some of these nincompoops, but anyway, I was just smart enough to wonder how my parents ever became adults. But there it was. And talking about going to church, I had to go in a military school because we marched to church. I never will forget, on Sunday mornings, the Baptists would fall in and the Methodists would fall in, and we'd march to church. And I wanted to be a Baptist so bad, because we Methodists had to march 17 blocks further than the Baptist. And if somebody had told me how, you say, Bob, why do you bring out these little things? Because that's where most folks are riding today. Do you know that? Most people are hung up in the church instead of in Christ. Most people are Baptists, are Methodists, are Episcopals, are Presbyterians. Those are just tags. You can be all of them, still go to hell if you've never been born again. But that's what the devil does. He gets you so church-centered that you don't need Christ, you think. But anyway, there it was. Military school, football was exciting, band was exciting, everything was exciting. But anyway, it came time to finish, and I decided to go to Auburn. It was known as Alabama Polytechnic Institute in that day. I received scholarships to 8 different universities, made all state there a couple of years in high school, had a chance to go over to Auburn. Well, when I got to Auburn, see, in high school, I was a big boy on the field. But when I got over to college, man, they had some whoppers over there. They played rough and tough and everything. See, in high school, I enjoyed it. In college, you endured it. Do you understand it? Over in high school, I was a big boy on the field. But when I got over to college, I looked like a chihuahua around a bunch of Great Danes. That's the truth. Chihuahua, you understand what I mean. I never will forget. You talking about church in college. Now, let me mention church. I didn't go. Man, who felt like going to church in college after one of those parties Saturday night? I didn't have mama there to make me go. The military, they wasn't there to march me. Nobody's there to wake me up particularly. And I remember how the guys used to say, Mama used to make me go, and I'm not going to go now, boy. So I'll never will forget it, one of the fraternity initiations, and I'll be in rush pretty heavy because they could see me fitting into their fraternity. And they said, Bob, you don't smoke? I said, no, man, I don't smoke. Coach told me not to smoke at all. I said, I remember how you used to stand out there and with one in his mouth and say, y'all don't do this, fellas, because it's bad on you. And they said, you don't smoke at all? I said, no, man, I don't smoke. They said, well, Bob, how you going to fit in with the group? I said, you got to do that to fit in? They said, yeah. I said, well, let me have one. And that was back when you just had to face bare facts. It didn't have charcoal, methylatum, or water, or nothing dripping from it. I mean, it wasn't extra 2 or 3 inches long or nothing. It wasn't outstanding. It wasn't a thinking man's type or nothing. You just had to just stick that old raw cigarette in your mouth, see. And I never will forget the first time, and I had this tough image going for me because I was already pretty big in scholarships and football. Every lady in the building, punch your husband. Just a minute, please. On that side, then punch. Thank you. There's a couple trying to go to sleep. Thank you very much. But anyway, this particular night, that's all right. He won't do it again. If he does, I'm going to come down and punch him myself. But anyway, this particular night, this particular time when I pulled in my little drag on it, see, because you got this tough image going for you, you didn't want to give yourself away. And I never will forget the first drag I took on it. And they said, did you like it? I said, man, it's terrific, isn't it terrific? And I wouldn't dare inhale because my daddy and mother told me if they ever caught me smoking, they was going to skin me alive. And I thought they meant it. And I remember one of the parties one night, they said, Bob, you don't drink? I said, no, sir, boy. Coach told me I didn't need to drink RCs, eat moon pies, because he said I had to stay in shape and I had to stay in tone so my body would be in condition. They said, Bob, you don't drink anything? I said, no, I don't drink. They said, well, you got a beer or two won't hurt you. I said, well, all right, if you got to have one. And that was back when you had to work hard to get them open. You didn't have any zippers on them. You had to have a screwdriver, a nail, or a church key or something. And yeah, I thought you knew. Bless your heart. I tell you, every once in a while I slip up on your blind side to see who's in our crowd. But anyway, this particular night we were riding in a car, and see, that's, the car's in, could out scratch our friend's car, and it gives you that tough image. Because, to have tough image, you got to smoke a little, drink a little, cuss a little, and stink a lot. And this is the image I had going for me. I never will forget the first time I turned a beer up in my mouth. You tell me, awful. And so the next swallow, instead of putting it in my mouth, I stuck my tongue in the hole of the can, see? And I never will forget, I'd turn it up and, it's good, fellas, good. And we'd pass a dark area, I'd throw it out and say, give me another one, say. A lot of these guys that going for so tough, they're not tough. You holler boo at them and it'll take you a week to get them back. But that's about the image I had. Football, life at school was it, popular fraternity boy. If I'd died, I'd gone to hell. And that's something, I didn't know anything about being saved. I didn't go to church. I remember one day, one squad was playing another. It's kind of an intra-squad game, and I had a cheerleader friend on each side I was kind of liking, and I played center on offense and linebacker on defense. You don't get to be a hero much when you're in the line. It's all of we big men, and there's some little squirt back here running up and down the field with a bag of zipped up air. He's the one that's always a hero, and we centers just get stomped on all the time. And they had a good cameraman there. And I said, if I could block a punt, the cameraman would take a picture, and the cheerleaders would see it, and boy, I'd be it at the party that night. So I found me a little daylight between guard and tackle. The man went back to punt, and I went sailing through wide open. I closed my eyes, jumped up, missed the man, but I hit the goal post straight on. I never will forget the next day when I woke up. I called my daddy. I said, Daddy, I want to join the Navy. My daddy said, son, that's mighty patriotic. I wasn't patriotic. I was scared. They was about to kill me up there. Well, anyway, my dad and mother signed the papers for that little brave he-man to go off into the war. So I went up and fought the Battle of Great Lakes. I never will forget when I was going into Great Lakes, I was confronted with a GCT test. Amen. General classification test. And I didn't really know what classification I was in. And I remember in Sweetwater where I was raised, and I was confronted with the first time with some kind of formulated opinions about myself. My name and my address and my various things, but it came down to religion. And you remember in Sweetwater we just had the Methodist and the Baptist religion. And on this square it didn't have either one of those. The first one was Catholic. And I knew I probably wasn't a Catholic. And the next square was Protestant. Protestant. And the third square was Jew. Well, I knew my daddy had a store, so I thought maybe I might have qualified for that last group there, but I punched this boy right by me, and I said, look, man, I'm hung up on this religion bit here. I said, would you mind helping me? He said, well, I'm a Catholic myself. I said, you're what? He said, I'm a Catholic. I said, well, I must not be that. I didn't even know how to pronounce it. He said, well, you sound like a Protestant. Put it down. That's what I was. I checked that little square. I was a Protestant with old tight blood and my serial number. See, that's the big religious movement that we have in our services today. They just want to know how to bury you in case you expire. And that was the picture of religion. You know who was in the boot camp with me? Baptists and Methodists and deacons and church members, Sunday school teachers. Nobody ever talked to me about the Lord. While the habits I didn't pick up at college, I could pick up in the Navy. I remember how we used to have a good time. Nobody ever asked me if I was saved. Nobody ever talked to me about my soul. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I was servicemen who leave the churches and go into the services? Wouldn't it be wonderful if they'd keep living for Jesus while they're in the military? Wouldn't that be something? But I didn't meet them. I'm sure they were there, but we just didn't fellowship together too much. So I went on into the Navy. After a year or so, came out. Nothing too gallant about my experiences. I just thank the Lord for the opportunity of being in and being out. And so I was brought to New Orleans to be discharged. My mother and daddy came back to meet the young boy that they'd sent off to the military school. See, ladies and gentlemen, what we forget about our kids, if we don't raise them up in the Lord, it's no telling what the devil will do with them when he gets a hold to them. Because the old boy, the sweet little boy, little Bobby that mom and daddy were raising was not the Bob that the Navy sent home. It wasn't the Navy's fault. It's nobody's fault but mine. I came home with habits in my life I was ashamed of. I came home and my heart had grown cold and hard, and my love for my parents wasn't there. My love for my brother wasn't there. I just was a different person. Sin hardens a person. Sin breaks a person from his perennial relation with his parents and children and with his brothers and sisters. So my mother and daddy came to meet me. Well, anyway, that night I went out on the town and had a party while my mother and daddy waited at the hotel, had me a little mustering out pay. I never will forget when I was going in the hotel room that night, I still had more respect for my mother and daddy than I did for God, I guess, because I never will forget I took tips and things to make my cigarette breath not be there. And I'd take something to try to kill the smell of a beer or something that I might have put. Isn't it amazing how a lot of kids in this building tonight don't want their mom and daddy to know what they're doing, but they care less at the fact that God knows all the time what we're doing. That's true. So my mother and daddy brought me home. I decided to go to the University of Alabama instead of Auburn this time. I was hoping their goalpost might be a little softer. So I went to the University of Alabama on a football scholarship, and my little high school sweetheart that I'd kind of been going off and on with in the mail and kind of been calling and writing and everything, we kind of had a pretty good case going, and she lived right down below Sweetwater, and my mother and daddy kept telling me it was puppy love, but it was sure real to the puppy, you know, and they kept on telling me it was puppy love, but I didn't know then it would lead to a dog's life. But anyway, a little bit later on, she came to the University of Alabama, and I had me about $85 mustering out pay in my pocket, and just rich enough to buy the whole school. And I think my daddy and I got together and bought our engagement ring. By the way, I owe him something on that too. I want to send him. And I met some guy on the campus that told us two could live cheap as one. Yeah, and I've been looking for him ever since. But anyway, I was just moon-eyed enough that I just kind of proposed and she kind of accepted. We were discussing religion. She says to me, Bob, you going to become a Baptist? I said, no, sirree. Them Baptists don't believe in nothing. I said, I'm not going to be a Baptist. They're just too narrow. She said, well, I'll become what you are. And that's what she did. She actually did, literally, symbolically, and real came what I was. So the next Sunday after we were married, we moved into the Trinity Methodist Church. Never will forget when they gave the invitation. It was one of those one verses. In case you want to join, you had to hurry. And she punched me in the side and said, come on, let's go. I thought I was back with Grandma. Anyway, we went down the aisle, and never will forget what a spiritual thrust it was. As we came down there, the Reverend said, how are you coming? I told him just fine. And he brought me over here and sat me down, and my wife and I sat there on the front pew, and some nicotinic smelling steward came over and said, fill this out. There's a clipboard and another card, and it had 3 squares on it. I thought I was back in the Navy. The first square was profession of faith. Well, I didn't know what that meant. Second square was coming by letter. I asked my wife if she'd written anybody, and she said she hadn't written the church at all. The third square was coming by statement. Well, I knew I hadn't said anything. So I just punched this old Stewart right in the Winston's, and I said, look, Stewart, all I want to do is join a church. He said, hit that second square. We both became members. 2 Sundays later, I became president of young adult Sunday school class. That was a Sunday I missed. A few weeks later, I became a junior steward in the Methodist Church. That meant I was a student, wasn't making any money. They get me ready in case I ever do, they'd promote me. Never will forget to have this manger scene one Christmas, and I played the part of a wise man, standing up out with his crooked stick. And I had this blanket wrapped around me, was standing about knee deep in hay. I had a little shrivel up mule standing there in the middle, and I was allergic to hay and mules. And I was standing there about to cough my head off, and I thought I felt silly as a wise man until I looked and saw who was playing Mary's part. And so I just stood there. I had a Zippo in my left hand pocket, and I was so nervous I struck it. That'll do something to you, boy. And anyway, after the services were over, people were so proud. I looked so good as a wise man. I was the dumbest man in the church, standing up there just as lost as I could be. But this is religion. This is where you see people today. On Sunday mornings in the average church, you see people shaking hands. That's what they're doing, just playing church. Most places just come on down and glad hand one another, fill out the card. If you can't fill it out, we'll fill it out for you. If you can't come back, just mail your tithe. That's about it. If you can't mail it, we'll come get it. And that's about the picture. This is a picture of religion. You don't need to come, just send it. Call us when you need a good funeral. That's about the picture. So anyway, football, scholarship at the University of Alabama, my wife and I, house. We lived in a house, wasn't a home. I never will forget how sin had started already breaking into our life. And Rhonda came along, our first daughter, then Mitzi, bless their little hearts. And I remember the Methodists sent some men by our house one time to get me to pledge, commit myself to some kind of amount of money to the church. And I remember I told those men, I don't want to be committed like that, because I don't want to commit myself to something I don't believe I can follow through on. I looked around, I was committed to the car, committed to the house, committed to the refrigerator, committed to the carpet, committed to my wife. Oh, Lord. I was committed to everything. But I remember how lightly I treated God. Sunday night, I didn't even know they was open. Wednesday night, I didn't know they had prayer meeting until after I was converted. But it's amazing how religious I was. Well, after 4 years at school, excitement in football, excitement in life, I was home about to break. Pre-med, biology major, chemistry and physics minor. After 4 years, I went into photography business there. I didn't want to follow through on the medical field. I didn't have the drive that you need for that profession. I went into photography business. Our home was, I believe the only reason, whatever it is, thank God for it, that my wife stayed with me was because there'd never been a divorce in our families. Or it may be because of the children. But whatever it is, I thank God for it. I thank God for it. She had all the reasons and grounds, and we just endured one another instead of enjoyed one another. And people ride by and say, Bob and Joyce live there, fine young couple. We were active in the country club, active in the Kiwanis club, I was active. Fine young junior executive. That's a tag they put on you when they want to put you on committees. And I became a steward in the church after the money started coming in. I got on committees and things like that. Our home was just about to fall. And I thought that if I'd get out of town, move out of town, we could start anew. So I wanted to go in the insurance business. Everybody then was starting their own insurance company. So I decided to move to Mobile, Alabama, a little suburb called Chickasaw, right out of Mobile. I thought if we moved down there, we could get a fresh new start. But you know, it never dawned on me when we moved that we took our problem with us, because my problem wasn't my hometown. My problem was me. And when I moved down there, oh yes, we moved on into the church, because that's just part of business life. You've got to have your church affiliation, your civic club affiliation, your social club affiliation. I got my wife into everything from the Petunia Plucking Society to the Snuff Sniffing League to the Canine Curling Corps. I had my wife going and coming, just keeping my image in front of folks, and I was active in everything you could get active in and stirred up the inactive groups. I was in the Moose and the Goose and the Got Loose Club. I was in country clubs, square and compass clubs, Odd Fellas, all of them, you name it, I was there. But anyway, after a little while there, our home was just gradually deteriorating. I had an opportunity in the insurance company to break every record the company had in the selling end of it. I loved to sell then, I love to sell now, but our home, it wasn't a home, it was just a house, about to break apart. After a year with Liberty National Life Insurance Company, I wanted to move out because we had a manager with that insurance company that was a religious fanatic. Dr. Rawlins, it's the first time I'd ever met somebody that would bring religious speakers into the organization to speak. On Friday mornings when we'd have a business meeting, office meeting, a staff meeting, he'd bring some Baptist preacher or he'd bring some religious layman in to talk to us. I never will forget, I used to say, Mr. Steiner, this is not the place for that. We are insurance men. I remember he used to say, Bob, why do you go to these nightclubs and things on the weekend? I said, man, I'm looking for prospects. Of course, I didn't tell him what kind. But I told him I was looking for prospects, because nowadays you feel like you got to get in with the hogs to get the hogs business. You know, you got to get in and wallow with them to wallow out with something. So that was my philosophy. Get on in there with them. I didn't want to be an old narrow-minded businessman. I just jumped on in with the pigs. Well, I was getting a little sick and tired of this Mr. Stein and this religious bit, and I had enough insurance knowledge then, I thought, to buy and sell the world. And I was about ready for my brokerage license with a big company, and I wanted to get away from this nut. So anyway, I saw an ad in the paper where Pan American Life Insurance Company was wanting to put on a broker. So I went down to see Mr. Jess Murray on Government Street. Never will forget, when I walked in, he looked at me and said, Bob, the Lord must have set you down here. I said, no, he didn't, man, no. I said, I come down here in my car. It's parked right out John in the front. He said, well, Bob, I've been praying for... I said, you don't mean I got another one. He said, what do you mean? I said, just forget it. Well, anyway, I didn't know this was the providence of God of planting these folks around like that. I didn't know it then and cared less. Never will forget, I got to talking with this man. Have you ever met somebody that after you got to knowing them, you could just kind of loosen up and talk a little? And I was living a life, such a life of make-believe. I had all this pressure built up within me. I guess I was content in the state that I was in, not even knowing what state that was. But I started kind of talking to this Mr. Murray. I started just kind of telling him about my life and my home and my marriage and my children not having the daddy they ought to have. And after a while, it got to sound a little silly to me that I was talking to a grown man, and here I was, already a pretty successful businessman, and telling that man. So I said, what do you want? You want to hire me or not? He said, yes, so I signed up. 2 nights later, he came out to the house to have dinner with Joyce and I. After the evening meal, I went back to get his coat, and he said, Joyce, you know what Bob needs is the Lord is his Savior. Well, I gave him his coat, and he left, and Joyce said, Bob, you know what he said? I says, no telling. What did he say? He said, you needed the Lord as your Savior. I said, well, didn't you tell him that I was a steward down at that Methodist church? Didn't you tell him that I was the chairman of last Saturday night's spaghetti supper? Didn't you tell him that I was the co-chairman of the blacktop committee that did one of the best blacktopping jobs that ever been blacktopped at that church? She said, well, he didn't ask all that. He just said you needed the Lord. So, well, we stopped that because she was a little old Baptist that didn't know much more about it than this little big old Methodist did. So the next night we had Mr. Murray and them join us for dinner. I went out to Goulis's restaurant, fine dinner club there. When we walked in, the waitress recognized me and said, you care for your usual, Mr. Harrington? I said, yeah, I guess so. Guess so. She didn't know I was with the holy group that evening. And so we sat down, and she brought me my drink. And Mr. Murray, do you care for a drink? You don't drink at all, do you, Mr. Murray? Ms. Murray, you don't either? How about you, Joyce? You off of it too, huh? So it's just me sitting there with my little Slim Jim glass with the little stick through the little olive. And I never drank beer. I went to honky-tonks. I was a country club boy, and always cocktails. A little finger always out, that's so you can wave at the loose women down the bar. And so there I stood. See, you can pinch others better when you have loose fingers. So there I stood with my little drink. Well, after my meal was over, You know, you have to have a cigarette to really kill the taste of the good food. So I said, Mr. Murray, you care for it? You don't do that either, do you, Mr. Murray? I said, how about you, Miss Murray? Do you care for a cigarette? No. I said, you quit this too, honey? See, my wife was the kind of church member, she could be holy with the holies and terrors with the terrors, and I didn't know what kick she was on that night. See, my wife actually, what you laughing at? Half of you just about the same. Just the same. Most folks I know live a life of pretense. Just put on, honey, come to preacher, let's act saved. And so my wife had a purse. My wife had a purse for church and a purse for parties. And it was embarrassing sometime at Sunday school when she brought the wrong one. So anyway, I never will forget when I said, you quit this too, honey. She had a spike heel on that night that was awfully impressive. And I can still feel the remains of it. But anyway, I sat there and I pulled in a deep drag, and Mr. Murray said, Bob, I used to be just like you until I got saved. And that's the first time that word ever took any attention to me. And I said to my wife, come on, let's dance. Got up there for a while. Next day, I went to Butler, Alabama to open up an insurance agency. Butler, Alabama, little town with a new paper mill moving in, new money, loose living, and 110 miles away from my wife. And it was an ideal setup for a young man trying to make good. So there it was at Butler. Butler, Alabama was just across the river from Sweetwater, my hometown. So I'd stay sometime over with my mother and work in the daytime, party some at night, go home maybe on the weekend. My wife really didn't care, just mailed the check. That was about it. When I'm getting up to the point I've been waiting to get to all night. See, I've heard me do this before, and I know what's fixing to happen next, and I can hardly wait. See, I'm already thinking 2 days ahead of what I'm saying, and it's just wonderful. I catch myself sometimes laughing before I get there. But anyway, this particular night, with business going in Butler, wife down in the Mobile, us up in the country, my mother helping me some and stay. This particular Tuesday, I was at Sweetwater, and I said, Mother, I understand they're having a revival over here at the Baptist church. She said, yes, that's right, son. I said, I think I'm going to go, Mother. You going to do what, Bob? I said, I think I'm going to go. Well, that's sweet, son. Now, she didn't know, but I was going to work Sweetwater the next day. And the businessmen always are there on every night because it just goes with their local position. And if they'd see me in church on Tuesday night, it'd create a better rapport the next day for my insurance pitch as I call on different people. So at 7:30 that night, I was watching Sergeant Bilko. You remember when he used to come on? And man, I liked him. I just sit there and watch old Bilko and just laugh, you know. But church started at the same time. And I needed church that night more than I needed Bilko. So I turned him off and I went down to the little Baptist church in Sweetwater. Every town has a typical Baptist church, brick with a little steeple and very few people. So when I open the door, it always squeaks a little. That gets the attention of everyone to turn around. Because in a little church, they're going to look at you every time you come in. But just in case the door didn't squeak, I had taps on my heels just to stir a little interest. And I came in that night and walked down the right side, and after I waved a little at those that kind of casually glanced to let them know I was there. And after I felt like everyone had seen Mr. Robert's son, the young executive, back home for a night, I sat down on the 7th pew. Well, the pastor of the church stood up and thanked Miss Lewis for the chicken supper. I thought I was back in my own church. And we're looking forward to being with Miss Allen tomorrow night. I thought, boy, I hope I can get through this one, all right. I reached up in my pocket and got my prospect book, and I'd look around, and I see Mr. Weiss. He could go about $20,000 whole life, and he could afford the premium if I'd get him by the physical. I looked over at others, and the preacher looked like he could go about $10,000 if I get the deacons to pay the premium, and I jotted him down there. In a few minutes, the pastor of the church said, and tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have a visiting evangelist. A visiting what? A visiting evangelist. We didn't even have visitors in our church. Didn't even have visitors, much less a visiting evangelist. And that little fella jumped up and ran up in here, and he said, ladies, and whoo, he was so harsh and loud. He was so emotional that I dropped my prospect book. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, he had the longest index finger of any human being I ever saw in my life. And it looked like he was having trouble with it all night. And I'd sit over there on that side. He said, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of good people are going to die and go to hell. And he'd come right over there with that finger. And he got where he could do it with either hand, but he'd come right back over with that finger. He could do it with both fingers. And this old boy, I can't remember too much of what his texts or his points or his poems were, but I can remember this boy was hung up on that going to hell. And in our church, we never told anybody he was going to hell. Only time I ever heard hell around our church is when somebody outside asked me to go. That's about it. We never had, we didn't get emotional. The biggest stir we ever had is when it was reported one time we had termites in the educational building, and I thought we were going to have a little touch of Pentecost, but we tore the building down, raised the preacher's pay, and kept on going, and that was about the picture. And he'd preach, and that finger, let me tell you, it's a wonder today he doesn't have cramps in it. But anyway, he said, if I told you once, and he said, I'll tell you twice, a lot of good people are going to die and go to hell. And he'd come right, and I thought I'd sat in the wrong group. And I looked around to see which group. Have you ever been under conviction? Have you ever been? And I knew my mama wouldn't have told him I was coming, and my mama wouldn't have told him I was going to hell. And I just started kind of looking around the group I was in, and I thought maybe, boy, that's it. They're going to hell. And he said, let's all stand and sing our invitation. Well, we had that in our church once, twice a year. And I remember how they used to stand and sing. Let's stand and sing one verse. Just as I am, nobody comes, we'll close. Nobody ever came. We didn't expect anybody to. If we had it, the preacher said, what's wrong with you? What's wrong? Well, anyway, this particular night we got up to sing Just As I Am without one plea. We sang the first verse and sang the second verse. The third, I said, look at the verses in this song. Third verse. See, the invitation was always a time for me to get my coat ready, get my lighter out, get one out of the pack, because you don't want to pull out your pack out front. You got a bunch of bums on the step. So I always had it just ready to hit it and, light it and leave. So this particular night we were singing and it got to the fourth verse. I can tell you now what was happening to me, but that night I didn't know. But my old heart was just pounding away. And I thought, I'm reluctant to use the word feeling for fear people might think you have to feel salvation before you accept the Lord. But that night, my old heart was just pounding. Have you ever been under real conviction? And we'd sing another verse, and I thought maybe, probably. I remember when I was a little boy, my mother used to have acid indigestion. And she took acidine nearly about every night. And I thought, that's probably what's wrong with me. I just have acid indigestion. And we'd sing that next verse, and my old heart was just pounding. Then I thought maybe I had overworked, and I was just feeling fatigued, and I dropped that silly idea. And then in a few minutes, I was trying to hold my song book, and it was getting a little heavy, and I just thought maybe I was under pressure or strain or something. And I was watching. Nobody else's book seemed to be too heavy. And I said, Lord, not out loud. I didn't even pray out loud in the church. In fact, I didn't even raise my voice in the church. Didn't even want to sing too loud. I said, Lord, I believe you're dealing with Otis. See, Otis was a barber, and he was standing right here by me. And I said, Lord, I believe you're dealing with Otis, and I just feel some of the effects of it. And I looked over at Otis, and wasn't nothing wrong with Otis. He's just standing there. And that little old preacher said, ladies and gentlemen, let's sing that fifth verse over again, because I feel like God's working on somebody here tonight. And I said, man, he sure is, but I had no earthly. See, I was already religious. I was a committee man. I was a pledger, and I was doing all. I had no earth. I didn't know what it meant to get saved. I didn't know what it meant to ask the Lord in your heart. And here I was, a religious man, standing in a crowd under conviction. Have you ever been under conviction? It's the strangest feeling in the world. You try to push it off. You try to blame everybody. You look around. You want to get out. You want to leave. You want him to hush, choke, or die, or something. And we'd start singing that fifth verse. My songbook got so heavy I could hardly hold it. Just like last night here, there's folks holding the pew and there's people holding songbooks. I've seen daddies hold babies in the arms to keep from responding to conviction. Hadn't you? And boy, that night I was just having a time with myself. And for the first time in my life, the Holy Spirit, I can tell you now what it was. That night I didn't know. The Holy Spirit resurrected my memory, and I saw myself like I was. I saw myself a phony daddy, a phony Christian, and it was horrible, deplorable looking picture. See, when the Holy Spirit breaks down that little image you've got of yourself, it's an awful looking thing when reality comes to you, and I still wouldn't give in. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know you could just come. I didn't know you could just ask. I didn't know you could just ask him in your heart. I didn't know that, and I was trying to fight something I didn't want to fight. I was trying to hold back from something I would to God I'd given in 2 years ago. I was standing there trying to hope he'd hurry. And we were singing that fifth verse over again. And I said, Lord, not out loud. I said, Lord, I believe what you want me to do is move so Otis can get by. See, Otis Otis was right in here, and I was standing next to the aisle, and Otis couldn't have possibly have made it by me. And the minute, listen to me, the minute I became willing just to move, the minute I broke whatever little resistance I had, the minute I just yielded a little bit to that want to in my heart, ooh, I started running down that aisle, knocked a pew over, hit a woman back of the hat, hat flipped under her chin. The preacher stuck out his hand. I didn't want no more handshaking. I grabbed him by the nape of the neck, and his tongue shot out about an inch. The evangelist came down to get this preacher loose, and I had me two of them. And in a few minutes, the song leader, I think they thought I was going to disrupt the services, or maybe speak in tongues or something, or shout or something. And I didn't know what all was happening to me, but I was enjoying it and having the best time. They took me in a little room upstairs, literally carried me up there, and they got me on my knees praying with me and telling me I was being saved and the Lord was coming into my heart. I said, that's right. And I'd jump up and hug the preachers again. I'd kneel down, pray again, tears running down my face. I was catching them. They was the sweetest things I ever shed in my life. I thought the preachers were doing something to me, and I'd jump up and hug them again, hold them again. I didn't know how to explain then like I know how to explain now what was happening to me. I never will forget one time I jumped up and had a $20 bill in my pocket, and I pulled it out and I said, split it between you, you know. I didn't know how to talk theologically. I didn't know how to tell them take it back and put it in the kitty and divide it later. I didn't understand all that, because downstairs I'd cut my hand and give them 50 cents to make it look like more. I'd pick that up from the Baptist, and it's amazing. So they'd take the Bible and show me more what I was doing and what everything. And after a while, they turned me loose and said, now you going home. I said, all right. Now here I am. My wife is in another town. Nobody's with me but me. And I was going back home. Got to the house. My mother came in a little later. I said, Mama, I got saved tonight. She said, well, that's fine, Bob. Have you had anything to eat yet, son? I said, Mama, I got saved. She said, well, I told you that was fine, but have you had any supper yet? I didn't know my mother couldn't rejoice with me, because my mother didn't know what it meant to be saved. My mother was just religious. She couldn't rejoice with me because she'd never been saved either. And here I was wondering, what's wrong? Anyway, she fed me, and I went to sleep, and I slept somewhere between the floor and heaven. Sheets felt like wings of angels spread over my body. I think they even dreamed heavenly dreams that night. And next morning, you know, I woke up. You got to have one right before breakfast, you know. Reached over for the pack. You talking about stunk. Pick you out one of those. Oh, it was awful. I felt so good. You ever remember when you got saved? When the Spirit of God moved into your life, you feel so good and clean. Don't you remember that, huh? Don't you remember it? I tell you, I didn't even want to touch anything hardly. I felt so good. And you know, I believe when anybody gets saved, the devil must put a demon on your trail right then, because, and here comes this personal devil. I believe he worked all night getting everybody I'd ever sinned with and had them over at my office the next day. Because here I am driving over to Butler. It looked like they were just waiting on me. Looked like a delegate there. I said, what am I going to tell them? Because we had a deal planned that night, something coming up that weekend, and my wife didn't know for sure if I was coming home this Friday or the next Friday, or any Friday. I said, well, I just tell them what I told Mama. And I walked up first and, hey, I got saved last night. Well, that's fine, Bob. I told a couple of the girls and a few of the fellas, and some of the fellas were glad. As I was walking up the street, as I came up the street, one of the old lawyers raised his window and he stuck his head out and said, Bob, I understand you got the religion last night. I said, yeah, you want me to come tell you about it? He said, no, not now. Pulled the window down. I walked on up to the drugstore, and there's a little table there where the fellas usually sit and talk about the guys and their wives, and primarily the latter. And this particular day I walked in, and the table just got clear of fellas, nobody left but Herman. I said, Herman? He said, I already heard, Bob. I said, what do you think, Herman? He says, one of the best deals you ever pulled, man. I said, what do you mean, Herman? He said, you go on with this kick. I tell you what you do, you get your tent and I'll get me some bottles. We'll fill them full of colored liquid, put about 70% volume alcohol in them. You go around healing folks, and I'll sell this stuff $1 a bottle. And we'll make $1 million and split it down the middle. I said, Herman, aren't you kidding? He said, aren't you, Bob? I said, no, man, I got saved. See, I didn't know then that everybody who's not saved thinks everybody who is saved is a phony until they are saved too. I didn't know that. I thought people would react just like I did, but oh, they don't. Can you imagine? I wanted to go home and tell my wife. See, when somebody falls in love with the Lord, you want to tell somebody you love immediately. And if you got this kind of salvation, you never told about it, you just never have really been saved. I don't believe anybody can be saved and not know it, because if you can be saved and not know it, you lose it, never miss it. Anyway, then I got in the car, took off toward Mobile. Riding down the road, clouds looked good, grass looked good, everything looked good. I was looking through new eyes for the first time in my 30 years, and I was just looking forward to being home. Used to, I was wondering if she's found out, wonder who's called, wonder who's written. Maybe I'll not go. Get a little bit more scared, I'd stop and get another little bit more bottle of strength, you know. You got to get that strength somewhere. They call it an escape valve, whatever it was. Anyway, I got a little closer to the house, and I heard a siren blowing. Well, I knew then I must have been speeding, so this patrolman stopped me. He said, where are you going? I said, look, officer, I just got saved last night, and you did what last night? I said, I didn't know you weren't supposed to tell everybody. And I was telling everybody. See, I found out later around the church it had to be on Tuesday and Thursday, and you had to be sure that it's a Baptist or somebody. I was telling everybody, see. He said, you did what last night? I said, I got saved last night. He said, let me have that. I never put that on one before in my life. I said, put it down. Saved, S-A-V-E-D. And a little bit later, it was raining out there on the man's book. I said, come on in and sit down. He came in and sat down, and he said, now what's this saved you did? I said, last night, I tell him how I'd been looking for this all my life. If someone had told me how to be saved, I believe I'd have been saved 20 years ago. If someone had just told me, I didn't know it was just a prayer way. I didn't know it was so wonderful to be saved. And I was telling him about being saved and knowing the Lord. And after a while, he said, you know, I need what you're talking about. I said, boy, you ought to get it. You sure ought to get it. He said, well, how'd I get it? I said, well, I tell you the only way I know is go over at Sweetwater and wait till a little after 7:30 and go in that right door in that little old Baptist church and go down and count them pews till you come to number 7 and ask if Otis is sitting there. And if Otis is sitting there, you get him to slide over and you'll get it, boy, you'll get it. I didn't know I could have led him to the Lord right in the car. I could have had him bow his head and ask Jesus to come in, but I didn't know all that. And I thought he had to go back to the same barn, be kicked by the same mule, the same bolt of lightning. It's like a lot of folks think they got to be on the road to Damascus and some big, great cataclysmic event. I didn't know I could have led him, but boy, let somebody ask me that now. In fact, they don't even have to. I'll ask them before they can ask me. But anyway, he tore up my ticket. See, it pays to be saved. And I took on off down to Chickasaw. Well, when I got there, I pulled around my house. My wife was standing in that. Now, ladies, you don't really know how to, maybe you do, though. You don't know how to appreciate what's fixing to take place right now. She's standing, I can see her working through the kitchen window. And I circled the house, and I remember I still had a key to it. She let me have the key. It was sweet of her. And I never will forget this cheery greeting when I opened the door. Is that you, Bob? That'll do something to you, you know that? Makes you kind of wonder, doesn't it? I think I'll call her when I get home tonight and find. Wonder who it was supposed to have been. Took some of you a little while to ride, didn't it, on that one, huh? You weren't thinking about me, you was thinking about you then, weren't you? So I opened the door and I walked in, and I never forget, I said, yeah, it's me. She said, come on in. She was just glad to see me. And I went on in the kitchen and I said, honey, guess what happened last night? It's no telling, Bob. No telling. And it wasn't really any telling what happened last night. I said, honey, look here. What is it, Bob? I said, honey, I found the Lord last night. You did what, Bob? I said, I found the Lord last night. She said, I didn't even know you was looking for him. See, I had more symptoms sprouting horns than I did wings. If I'd have told I'd bought the Empire State Building and leased it out to the Yankees, it wouldn't have been any more surprise. But she turned about that time and came back there. She said, you're not kidding, are you, Bob? I said, no, honey, come here, look at me. I said, look, I smell. I had nothing to drink, honey. No vodka. Look at my eyes. You can tell when I haven't had it. So look at my fingers. I went and got me some lemon juice. And I said, been to the dentist, got my teeth cleaned. I said, I feel saved too, honey. She said, Bob, you're not. I said, no, I'm not putting on, honey. I'm saved. I'm saved. They told me I was saved last night, and they told me the Lord had come into my heart, and I want you to know. And she said, Bob, I sure hope you're serious. I said, oh, honey, I'm serious. I said, go get the kids. You don't know how to love your kids till you fall in love with Jesus. They were just two little girls running around the house till I fell in love with Jesus. See, before you fall in love with the Lord, you're so busy in loving yourself, you forget to love your wife and your kids and your friends and Jesus. And here come little Rhonda and Mitzi, and Mitzi's about 4 and Rhonda's about 7. And they came running in there, and they were so glad to see Daddy, and Daddy was so glad to see them. And I never knew how sweet they were till I took them in my arms and I sat down and I said to Rhonda, I said, Rhonda, would you forgive me for not being the daddy I should have been? She said, oh, yeah, Daddy, I forgive you. I forgive you. I said, you sure you forgive me? She said, yeah. Little old Mitzi, eyes brown, sitting up there. What's wrong, Daddy? What's wrong with you, Daddy? What's wrong? I said, honey, would you forgive me? Sure they would. If I'd have shot everybody in the neighborhood and come in and ask them, they'd have forgiven me. But I didn't know what I should have been doing as a daddy. And now I'll tell you, we hugged and rejoiced. And I turned up and looked at my wife. I said, honey, would you forgive me too? I said, honey, if you will, you'll never be worried about me again as long as we live. She said, I'll forgive you, Bob. Oh, buddy, I didn't know a home could be so wonderful. I didn't know love was so real. I didn't know marriage and children were so precious till I fell in love with Jesus. Next day, the preacher from Sweetwater called and said, Bob, would you come up here and give your testimony? I said, give my what? Give your testimony. I said, I don't know what that is. He said, would you come tell the people what happened to you? I said, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. Here comes this devil again. He said, you're going to go up and... See, the devil, you can't maybe see him move his lips, but he'll talk to you. You'll move yours. Sometime I've had him talk, and I talk back, my lips move, and must look strange to people see me riding down the street, you know, but he'll work on you. He said, you're going to go back up and tell them people you're not going to last. I said, well, I'm going to tell them anyway. I'm going to tell him. I said, don't you know that bank president? You remember you was late a little bit on your notes, and he's going to be there. I said, well, let him come on. Let him go. Some of your old girlfriends going to be there, and they're going to laugh at you. They're going to laugh at you. I said, well, let them laugh. I said, you come on too, devil. I've seen your showroom for 30 years, and all you've done is deceive me and lie to me and lead me wrong and about break up my home and about pull my children away from me. And you took every good thing I've had and just about ruined it. I said, you come on too, devil. And that night, boy, I'll never forget, I got to church early, came down and sat on the front pew. The preacher invited me to come up. I started walking up here. I was scared to death. Longest speech I ever made before I was saved was 5 minutes. I was scared 4 minutes and 60 seconds. And I just walked up there and it looked like everybody had a little dart in the eye, and the church was packed. People came to see what Mr. Roberts' son had going now, and they came and looked like everybody had a little dart and said, I'm going to get him first if you don't. And I was so scared when I went to open my mouth it wouldn't work. And I tell you, my old pucker swiveled up on me, and I ever eat a green persimmon? I felt like I'd had a few. And I looked over at Miss Lewis at the piano and I said, would you play a verse of Amazing Grace? How sweet the sound. And when she played that, the Spirit of God moved on my soul. And I tell you, he loosed my tongue and I started talking. And for the next unknown time, I started telling people about what happened to me, how Jesus had come in my heart, how my sins had been forgiven, my house had been made a home, I was going to miss hell and make heaven. And for the next, I just kept on. And I didn't know how to give an invitation. I didn't know how to ask people to come forward. So I said, ladies and gentlemen, if there's anybody in here tonight that wants to happen to you what happened to me the other night, would you come on right now? Would you come on? And you know who's the first person to come? You know who's the first one? My mother. My mother came and stuck her hand up to mine and said, son, I want to be saved. And God saved her right there. Right behind my mother was Boots that worked in my daddy's store. Behind Boots were my Aunt Mitty. And before the service, over 16 people were at the altar giving their hearts to Jesus. And it's right there during that invitation that this great omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God called me to preach. Let me know through his love that he'd been preparing me. He'd been taking care of me, and he laid a want to on my heart to preach. And bless God, I've been preaching somewhere ever since, telling people what Jesus did for me, he can do for you. And I hope till Jesus comes again, somewhere, every day of my life, I'll be testifying of the saving power of Jesus Christ. Does this ever happen to you? Amen. Like what happened to me on that night, April the 15th, 1958, in that little Baptist church in Sweetwater, Alabama, located there on the 7th pew doing the 5th verse of Just As I Am. If this has never happened to you, it can happen to you now. It can happen to you now if you just let Jesus come into your heart. Bible says, therefore, if any man be in Christ. Say it with me. Therefore, if any man be in Christ. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Thank God for that. Let's bow our heads as we pray.